Well, I want to welcome you to Grace Fellowship. My name is Joe Boyd. I'm lead pastor here. And along with an incredible group of leaders and our dream team, which is our incredible group of volunteers, we want to welcome you to Grace Fellowship. We're in a series called The Story, and we're in a segment of it called Kingdom and Collapse. Now, today we know that everything rises and falls on leadership, and you might have just noticed that we are going to be a host site for the Global Leadership Summit. How many of you have ever heard of that before? Yeah, some of you in the business community. It's something that got started with the church, connecting with the business community, and it started out as an idea that became the largest global leadership event. They have simulcast locations all over the world. And in the Twin Cities, Bethel was the host site that invited all the churches and businesses to attend, but they maxed out. And so they said, hey, we need to look for another location. And because of your leadership, because of your dedication and the influence that you have in our community, we were their first call. And so we're going to be hosting one of the locations for the GLS Global Leadership Summit. And if you're part of a business or you lead a business or you're a business leader, I would encourage you to participate in this with us because it's going to be life-changing. Now, why would we go to the trouble to offer something like this? It is very simple, that we have a vision that we want to help everyone experience grace. And we do that by leading and loving our cities. And today, with parents dedicating their children to follow God, I think that's a perfect example of parents and a church leading and loving our cities, because our kids are not the future of the church, they're the church right now, and we get to be a part of that. Now, today we're going to continue in the story. And if you're here for the first time today, you're here on a great Sunday, because you can jump in with us right now, right where you are. Every week is a standalone, but it also builds. And we're in a book called The Story. We're reading this. It is taking the Bible and putting it in chronological order so that we see it from start to finish. Many people say that they have a bucket list goal to read the whole Bible. This is a really great way to jump in and do that. And so today, we are focusing in on this section that we call Kingdom and Collapse, where the kingdom is being established, leaders are being established, but through disobedience and missteps, there is a collapse. And I believe that there's lessons for each and every one of us to learn. How many of you have ever had a moment where you went from zero to hero? How many of you know what I'm talking about when I say that? Okay? And how many of you have had a moment where you went from hero to zero? Yeah, okay. Welcome to Grace Fellowship. I love this one story I want to share with you that I think highlights this. At the turn of the century, whenever indoor plumbing wasn't really a thing, there were a lot of homes and farmhouses that had outhouses as their outdoor plumbing. And if you've never experienced that, then you might want to avoid that. But the outhouse was this little house that you would go and use the bathroom in. And this little boy, he didn't like the outhouse. He didn't like it because it was old, it was creaky, it was stinky. He didn't like anything about it. In fact, he got so tired of looking at it that one day he had this bright idea. Anybody have a bright idea that's going to cost you? Yeah, this little boy did. And he decided he was going to take this huge branch that he found laying on the ground, and he was going to wedge it in and dump the outhouse over into the creek, never to deal with the outhouse again. And so he got over there and he decided to do it, but he realized, man, this thing's heavier than I thought it was. And so it goes over and it goes into the creek and it goes down the creek, and he runs away laughing and I did that. Only to find out at dinner that he was in trouble. Because his dad came and sat down at the dinner table and he said, son, after we eat dinner tonight, you and I need to have a meeting behind the woodshed. How many of you know what that means? That means you're in trouble, you're getting a spanking, and there's going to be consequences. And he said, do you know why? And he said, well, I don't know, Dad. Why would I be meeting you behind the woodshed? And he said, well, someone dumped the outhouse over into the creek. Did you do it? And he owned it. He said, yep, Dad, that was me. I cannot tell a lie. It was me. And he said, well, then meet me after dinner behind the woodshed. He said, Dad, but before we go there, today in school, we were studying about George Washington, and he chopped down a cherry tree, and he was honest about it, and he didn't have to pay the consequences for it. And the dad looked at him and said, that's true, son, but his dad was not in the cherry tree. I love that story. Because I think that we can all relate to making decisions or making mistakes that we get caught or exposed in, and we feel embarrassed, and we maybe feel ashamed, and we feel regret. I think every person in this room knows what it feels like to carry regret from the decisions that we've made. And in fact, I think sometimes we may even ask ourselves this question: can God still use me after what I've done? Now, for some of us, we're like, the outhouse isn't that big of a deal. Like, if you knew what I did, man, that really created a stink. I've done things that I'm not proud of, and I'm not sure that God could ever use me. And oftentimes we feel disqualified by our past, but our past doesn't have to dictate our future. Today, we're going to be talking about David. And last week we talked about David going from shepherd to king. And many people said that last week really resonated with them because they feel like other people don't see them. And he was 16 years old when he was anointed by God, but he was 30 years old, 14 years later, before he was anointed to be the king. And David, even though he had a heart after God, was still a human, and he did make some pretty big mistakes. And today we're gonna learn that he made a tragic mistake where he went from zero to hero and hero to zero in a matter of a lifetime. And I think we can identify with that. But today, the point that we want to teach is failure does not have to be the end of your story. We have a God that is so good that he can redeem our stories. He is a God of second chances. And no matter how much we mess up, God can turn our messes into a message. Throughout this series, we've talked about the concept of an upper story and a lower story. The upper story is God's view of how he would like things to go. It's what he is calling us to rise to the occasion to experience. The problem is most of us live in the lower story where we can't see around the corners, we don't know what's happening. And in fact, sometimes we fall into temptation, we step into traps that the Bible would call sin, that really messes up our life. And we feel like we're stuck in this lower story. But God is going to teach us today that you don't have to stay in the lower story. We can experience his upper story wisdom and plan for our life. And whenever we experience that, we discover that God really does have a plan. Now, today we're going to continue on with David, and we're going to talk about his kingdom, where he starts at 30 and he moves forward. And this really kind of highlights something about David when everything was going well. If you can imagine drawing a graph, the X and the Y, at the first half of his kingship, everything was going up and to the right. Everything was. I mean, it was just like, it was success on success. 2 Samuel 8, verse 15 really highlights this. It says, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right. And he did it just right. He was just and right. And everything was going up and to the right. And it just seemed like it was never going to change. In fact, when we take a look at the trials of a king, which is what we're talking about today, he becomes the king, and then he's living in the palace in rest of his enemies. He's not struggling at this point. In fact, he even has a conversation in 2 Samuel 8 with God. He says, "Who am I, O sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you have brought me this far?" He's saying, I can't believe this is happening to me. pinch me. This can't be real. He says, is this your usual way of dealing with man, O sovereign Lord? He's saying, I can't believe it. I'm living the dream. And in fact, he goes on in that chapter, we find out he wins battles. And then there's this point where he's doing everything right. The verse I highlighted in 15, where he's reigning over all of Israel and doing what is right and just for all his people. And the people appreciate him and love him and cheer him on. He's a great warrior. He's fulfilling God's promises. I'm not going to highlight that today, but read the story, read the chapter, because it's an incredible illustration. But then in fact, at one point, it even said that he killed 1,000 people by himself in a day. That's incredible. He's a warrior. And so he's winning more and more battles. And everything is going up and to the right. Everything on this graph says, hey, it's just never going to end. Have you ever had one of those moments where everything's going great and then it's not? I got an amen on that one. And it's like that. And he has this pivotal moment in 2 Samuel chapter 11. You'll notice one small change, and it's this pivotal moment in 2 Samuel 11, where everything was going fine, and then it wasn't. And everything was going so great, and he was so successful, but I think it's worth saying, because this is true for David, and this is true for you and I, that sometimes our greatest vulnerability comes during our greatest success. When we walk around and we say, we're too successful to fail, watch out. When we think that we've made it, we need to be careful. And when everything's going right, we need to remember why it was going right. Because when we turn inward and do our thing instead of God's thing, we're going to find that this is a pivot moment. Now, what we find is that David is on top of the world. And literally, in chapter 11, he's on top of the world. He's at the top of the palace. He's in the highest building. He gets to walk around on the rooftop. He's able to look down and see everything else over the kingdom. And we find, if you can imagine, this is what it was like, him looking out. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, it says, in the spring of the year, the time where kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the Amorites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Now, he should have been out there leading the charge, and he was a great warrior, and he knew what to do, but he chose not to do it. He chose to stay in his palace. And rather than being right in the will of God, now he's out on the edges, walking the perimeter of this kingdom. And because he's at the highest place, he has this vantage point on the city. The problem with that is that in the city, the height of buildings offered some privacy, because most people are down on the ground and they can't see up. And so women would go and bathe on rooftops. And David, as king, would have had a visual on that happening. And one day he's walking by and he sees a woman he can't take his eyes off of, and her name is Bathsheba. And she's very attractive. And he looks and he looks again, and then he keeps looking. In fact, he starts to plot and realize, I'm the king, I'm the only man here. I'm going to leverage my power in his pride, and he brings Bathsheba in, and he woos her, and he dines her, and then things lead to the bedroom. And Bathsheba becomes pregnant. Now he's realized that he sinned, he's crossed the line, he was disobedient, and there's going to be evidence of his sin. And so this is where David decides, rather than own it, he's going to cover it up. And I don't know about you, but there are times when we make mistakes that we want to cover up our mistakes. But the problem is, whatever we try to cover up, it's going to find its way out. And so what he decides is that he can't unring that bell. So he decides he's going to leverage his power as the king and call for Uriah, who is her husband, and he's going to give him a furlough, a relief, a little R&R to come home. And he's like, he's gonna come home, he's gonna see his wife, and then they'll reconnect and he'll think he's the father. Because his greatest fear is like showing up on Maury Povich and having the moment where they do the test and they go, David, you are the father, right? I mean, he doesn't want to deal with all that. And so he's like, I got this plan. This is totally gonna work. The problem is Uriah did the right thing. And you might say, what's the right thing? Well, he comes back and he doesn't go into the house. He actually stands guard at the front of the house. He doesn't go in. He sleeps on the steps because he didn't think it would be right for him to go see his wife when every other man in the kingdom is out fighting and risking their lives. In fact, David is so shocked by this because now David is doing things so wrong, he can't even imagine that somebody would do something right. And this is the response. We see this in verse 11. Uriah said to David, the ark of Israel and Judah are staying in tents. And my commander Joab and his lord's men are camped in open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? And as surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. And man, imagine the heaping coals that must have felt like on David's head because he's like, this guy's not doing the wrong thing. And he's like even calling out, even to my face, what I'm doing is wrong. And you would think maybe this is the turning point where he comes clean and he does the right thing. And Uriah's integrity just exposes David's compromise. But David doubles down. And David lets sin lead his actions. And have you ever noticed that when you start to make bad decisions, sin creeps in, takes over, and it's just like default? Bad decision after bad decision, domino effect, all the way to our demise. And so what he decides is if he can't trick him into believing it's his kid, he's going to eliminate him. And first he commits adultery, now he's about to commit murder. In 2 Samuel 11, verse 15, just 4 verses later, he tells the commander to do this. So he involves other people in his sin. He says, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. He left one good man behind and he let him just die. This is what happens with sin. Now, you might say, I mean, he is the king. Problem eliminated. Is he going to get away with it? No. He's not going to get away with it because sin has a way of always coming out, and God loves us too much to leave us in our sin. In fact, God sometimes sends people to confront us in our sin. And God used Nathan to confront David. Now, some of you might say, well, who's Nathan? Well, Nathan was a prophet who was God's man. He loved God, he knew God's word, he would speak to God on a regular basis, and he would give advice, spiritual advice to David. And every one of us in this room needs somebody like Nathan, a spiritual advisor, a mentor in our life. And if we don't have somebody like that in our life, we've got blind spots, and we've got an opportunity to make a wrong turn. And it would be like you and I going to the gym and trying to lift heavy weights and not having a spotter. We all need somebody to watch over us in our life. Well, Nathan, either through his position in the inner circle, heard about what David had done. Because obviously he told people to get rid of Uriah. So it would have been maybe in the murmurs and in the secret conversations. But I also think that God probably spoke directly to Nathan and said, hey, our boy David can't keep going like this. And you need to go speak truth to him. And that had to be scary because he's a spiritual advisor, but he also knows that David just killed a man. And he's got to go say, hey man, you're wrong. Imagine the pressure of that. Imagine going in and telling your boss, hey, you're really messing it up. And so what he decides to do is he uses the power of a story to reveal a deep truth. And he goes to David, like he often would, and said, King, I need to talk to you. I need your advice about a situation. And he's like, okay, well, what's the situation? He said, there was this rich ruler in the kingdom who had other people that were poorer than him under his leadership. And dignitaries were coming to town, and he was supposed to meet with them and throw a feast. But rather than spend his own resources and kill his own livestock, he went to the poor man who only had a single baby lamb. And he loved that baby lamb. He cared for that lamb. He sacrificed for that lamb. And this rich ruler took that man's lamb, slaughtered it, and served it for a meal, and left him with nothing. And the Bible tells us that David got really angry. He visibly changed. He got furious. And he goes, that guy is a jerk. I mean, that's like my version of the Bible, not the Bible, but he did. He was just like, this guy's totally wrong. Like, it's so wrong that he did that. He took something from somebody else, and he didn't like live within his own means, and he's wrong for that. And he should suffer for that, and he should pay. He should pay 4 times what he took away. And then he asked, who is this man? And Nathan speaks to him and says, you are this man. And he's shocked. And he's caught. And he knows it. I think it took a lot of courage for Nathan to do that, but many of us, we're Minnesotans, and we're nice, and we won't tell you to your face, but we might talk about you behind your back. Confrontation is not something we're really good at. I got to see an expression of biblical confrontation when I was a youth pastor over 20 years ago. How many of you are old enough to remember Extreme Makeover Home Edition? Remember that? They used to like flip houses for people, and it was a really cool thing. At that time, I was a youth pastor, and we had done that for a family in this community down in Houston, Texas. And the next year, we decided to go to the next level, and we did it for a church. And I remember my wife and I driving around, we were praying, like, how are we gonna walk into a church and be like, hey, your church needs to be fixed up? And but we did, we prayed, and God led us to this church called Casa de Oración. And we found out when we went there that this pastor had moved from South America to Houston specifically for the purpose of reaching people who were immigrants to Houston, Texas, who needed to know Jesus. They were a missionary, and they came. And they started this little church, and we convinced them that we were gonna come in and flip it, and we said, hey, what do you need? And they said, well, we need everything painted, and we need projectors and screens and some artwork on the walls and all this stuff. Oh, and by the way, we needed carpet. We looked down, and the carpet was terrible. But we had people in our church that were as passionate about Extreme Makeover as we are about Dollar Club. I mean, people were generous and they were giving, and I had a builder that said, hey, I've got all this extra carpet. You can even pick it out. It was incredible. And so we let them pick out the carpet, and it was amazing. We start the project. We're doing this whole Extreme Makeover. They're not there. They can't see any of it. And we're in the middle of it, and that's when we realized that the contractor that gave us the carpet was not going to provide the people to install the carpet. And if you're looking at your boy right here, you know that I'm not the guy to install carpet. And I got panicked. And I'm running this thing, which is crazy. And my wife says, listen, I'll take it. Let me go find somebody to install this carpet. How much money do we have? We had a few $100s. It was pretty sketch. And we had to get this done because the next day they were coming to church. And so she left, she talked to several people, and a bunch of carpet companies said, nah, we can't do it, we're busy. Nah. She goes to this one place, and this guy, he says, where's this at? And she goes, Casa de Oración. And he goes, oh. And he didn't really want to go, and she said, would you just come and see? And he goes, well, I don't really want to go over there and see that pastor. They're not there. Oh, okay. And he went over. And he walked around, he looked at everything, and he said, well, we'll put it in if you got the carpet. And so he gets his guys, and they start putting it in. And I started getting nervous because I'm like, did we get a bill? Do we know how much this is going to cost? Like, what if we do this and now we can't pay him? And I go to the guy and I said, hey, I know you already started, but how much is this going to cost? And he said, sir, if I had to tell you how much this cost, you couldn't afford it. And I said, wow, well, can I ask why you're doing this? And he said, yeah. He said, 10 years ago, I used to go to this church. I said, you used to go to this church? He said, yeah, I was a single guy and I had a girlfriend and we got pregnant. And we decided the easy thing for us to do was to have an abortion. And the pastor said, you shouldn't do that. Two wrongs aren't going to make a right. And we got really mad and we left. And I said, and you're here today installing carpet? He said, yeah, but I respect the fact that he acted on his conviction. I said, that's fair. I said, this is great. They're going to love this. Would you like a chance to see him again? And he said, yeah. I said, we're going to have a dinner and a big reveal over at our church. We'd love for you to come be a guest at our table. And he said, okay. So they finished this and the reveal is amazing. But what I learned in that moment was that just like Nathan was used by God to confront David in his sin, God used this pastor to speak truth even though there was a risk. And the point that I want to make is that conviction is not God rejecting you. Conviction is God pursuing you. He loves you so much, he'll meet you in your sin, but he loves you too much to leave you there. And that's how much God loved David. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's the difference between Saul and David? They were both kings, they both made mistakes. Saul, he kind of did an altar. We learned this from our teenagers. He did a burnt offering and he didn't wait on the man of God. The other thing he did was he didn't fully follow through on eliminating these people God told him to wipe out. But he also made excuses and blamed everybody else and he didn't take responsibility. David was a guy after God's own heart. But David committed adultery and then killed a man to cover it up. That's pretty bad. Actually, it's really bad. But when you fast forward and you look at it, in Hebrews, they had this hall of fame of faith for people. Saul's not there, but David is. Even though David seemingly did worse thing as a murderer. And it makes me ask the question, why? How could that even be? And it's because in his moment of conviction, he doesn't make excuses and he doesn't blame other people. In 2 Samuel 12, verse 13, he simply says, I have sinned. He owned it. He knew he had done something far worse than chop down a cherry tree. He knew he'd done far worse than pushing the outhouse in the creek. He knew that he had committed adultery, he had offended God, and he had killed a man to cover it up. He was that man. Yet he owns it. In fact, whenever we look at this, what we realize is that repentance does matter. That God really does hear us when we own our mistakes. In fact, later, if you were to read all of Psalm 51, and I would highly recommend that we do that, but I want to highlight just this one verse in verse 10. After he says, God, I've sinned, I've messed up, I totally bombed it. He says in verse 10, create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. He's saying, make me clean again. I messed up, God. Give me a second chance. And God was so good to do that. And this isn't image management. This is after the fall. This isn't him like trying to put on a show or act like, oh, I'm reformed now. You know, what he's doing is he's having a genuine repentance moment. And the amazing thing to me is that David was forgiven. God forgave him. But consequences remained. Like, here's the thing. People think that if God forgives them, all the problems go away. If I left here today and I was really hungry and I wanted to beat all of you over to the restaurant and I speed over there and I get pulled over, I can ask for God to forgive me, but I'm still going to have that ticket. You know how I know that? Because I've gotten a ticket. When I was a youth pastor down in Texas, I got pulled over. I thought I was going to be all slick, pull out my business card. Youth Pastor Joe handed it to this officer. He looked at it and he goes, "Oh, you should know better," and wrote the ticket anyway. And then compounded the problem and brought his rat kid in my youth group and said, "You help him." I was like, "What?" But that's the way it goes. Kids aren't rats, by the way. But anyway, his kid was bad. I know, because I was really bad. But anyway, so here's the thing. We see that everything was up and to the right, and then he has this pivot moment, and then things go south. Look at what happens. 2 Samuel 12. The baby that him and Bathsheba have dies. Like, he loses a child after he's killed somebody and feels that pain. He goes on, he has a daughter, and she gets raped. But remember, he exerted his power over another woman, and he's feeling this pain. He goes on to have a series of kids. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. He had 8 wives. And Joe Boyd and the Bible will tell you that's not a good idea. Pick one, stick with them, okay? But anyway, he has a son that rebels and tries to take his throne. Then that son dies. Then he has another major rebellion against him. I mean, everything is going south. Like everything, he was at the top and now he's going to the bottom, and it's not going well. And in fact, when you look all the way across, he ultimately dies after he passes off the kingdom. But here's the thing, in 40 years, he goes all the way to the top to all the way to the bottom. And it's just this incredible thing. And my question for us is this: what happens if we don't change? If we just continue to sin and do whatever we want to do, what happens? Hidden sin never stays hidden. If you think hidden sin stays hidden, trust me, sin is like telling your youngest child to keep a secret. The world's going to know. It's coming out. And what begins as compromise becomes collapse. And our unchecked decisions can fracture generations to come. And David's bad decision-making affected so many people. When we tell ourselves this lie that I'm not hurting anybody but myself, we have lied to ourselves and lied to God. And we talk about this all the time, that we want people to experience grace. Why? Because grace restores relationships with God, but this is the grace and truth part. But earthly consequences may continue. Just because we've said we're sorry to God doesn't mean that we don't owe restitution to the people that we've hurt or pay a penalty for our crimes. There are real consequences to what we've done. And God highlights this. But here's the amazing thing. Even after failure, David still worships God. When you hit rock bottom and everything, you're facing consequences, do you still praise God, or do you say, "God, why am I here?" God says, no, praise me. And David praised God. He worshiped God. That's how we know that he had a heart after God and he returned to God. In fact, in 1 Chronicles 29:11, it says, "Yours, Lord, is the greatest and the power." He quit talking about how he was top of the world. Now he's pointing to Jesus and Jesus alone. And he's saying, "You are the one, and I'm going to trust you. Even at my worst, I still will worship you." And the point that I'm making today that I think applies to all of us is God redeems broken stories. And if you're here today and you feel like you're messed up and you've made too many mistakes and God can never use you, I'm here to say, slow down, Trigger. I think God can still use you. And here's how I know. Because before David died, he had a successor. And his successor was Solomon. Now, I told you he had 8 wives, he had a bunch of kids. The oldest kid should have been the one that was next in line, but he wasn't. Bathsheba and David had a child, a boy, and his name was Solomon. And God chose Solomon to be the next king, for the family line to go through this broken, messed up, Jerry Springer kind of a relationship. And yes, Maury did say, "David, you are the father." I mean, it was like crazy. In fact, God, I love this. God is so honest. He'll just tell the truth, man. That's what I love about the Bible. They don't pull any punches. Look at this. Bathsheba actually enters in to Jesus' lineage. If you go into Matthew, the first book of the gospel, the New Testament, in chapter 1, verse 6, here's what it says. David was the father of Solomon. Can you hear Maury saying that? I can, every time I read it. Whose mother had been Uriah's wife. What? Like he didn't even go, no, it's Bathsheba. I mean, some other stuff happened, but her name was Bathsheba. No, he's like, that's Uriah's wife. He is calling out 1,000 years later, he's still heaping the coals on David. Like, hey man, truth's truth. Deal. And if, to be honest, if I was writing the Bible, I would have edited that out. I'd have been like Bathsheba. You know, I'd have been nice about it. But God leaves her name in the story on purpose. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, well, why? And it hit me because God's not ashamed to use broken people to redeem them and his story. And if God can use messed up people like David and Bathsheba and Joe Boyd, there's not a person in this room that God can't use. None of us are so messed up that God can't redeem us and take us to a different place and experience the upper story. So today, I want to finish with this idea. How can God turn your mess into a message? You might be sitting here and saying, Joe, I'm messed up. Like, I'm so messed up, all they're going to see is like the mess up. But God turns messes into messages. And there's 3 simple ways we can do it by identifying with 3 critical characters in this story. The first one is be like Uriah. Be like Uriah. Do the right thing even though it costs you. I'm going to tell you God's honest truth. You can do the right thing and sinful people will still do things to hurt you, disgrace you, maybe even kill you. But there is good news because you would be in the same company with Jesus because Jesus did everything right and they killed him anyway. The only problem was they couldn't keep him down. And because he can get up, we can get up when we follow him. So be like Uriah. Do the right thing even though it may cost you. Number 2, be like Nathan. Be like Nathan. Be willing to confront somebody and have the courage to lovingly tell them the truth. You know, I told you part of the story about the extreme makeover. Let me tell you the rest of the story. We're eating dinner that night, and the pastor couple come in from Casa de Oración. And this other guy's sitting there with his wife, and the pastor's looking at this guy like, I know you from somewhere. It's been 10 years. And I said, let me introduce you. Pastor, this is the person who installed the carpet. His name is, and he reaches over and shakes his hand. And instantly, the pastor remembers the conversation that he had. He said, wow, I haven't seen you in 10 years. How are you? He said, well, Pastor, we were pretty upset. We left. We were mad. But you told the truth. I want to introduce you to my wife. You knew her as my girlfriend. And we got married. You told us we should get married. And we were so fortunate. We started a family. This is our little girl. And he looks at her and he goes, oh, you're so cute. How old are you? And she said, 10. And then he realized that not only did they get married, they kept that child. And that was living proof of a loving God to a watching world. And I got to be on the front row of seeing obedience that cost this pastor a relationship for 10 years speak grace and truth that led to somebody feeling conviction and doing what God called him to do. And that little girl grew up. And this father who installed the carpet with tears in his eyes said, Pastor, I can't thank you enough for telling the truth. because of you, this little girl has been the greatest joy in our life. And we almost threw it away. Church, be like Nathan. Be like Nathan. As a father of 5 adopted children who are alive, are the greatest joy in Michelle and my life. And we are so thankful. And I just got to tell you, I'm a biblical pastor. I'm not a political one. I'll tell you this, I'm pro-life. And I'm not backing down off of it. And I'll tell you why. It's not political, it's biblical. God cares deeply about every single life. He's the one that brought us in, and he's got plans for every one of us. And even if your life looks like a mess, he can turn it into a message. Lastly, be like David. What? David committed adultery and murder. Yeah, but he also confessed and repented. And so when you're caught, when you're in your sin, own it. Repent and turn back to God. Failure doesn't have to be the end of your story. I don't know where you are today, but I think that some of us in the room are struggling with some things. And I want you to know that God can restore a fractured marriage. God can restore your integrity. God can restore your joy. God can restore the calling that you had on your life that you hit pause on because you did other things that weren't God honoring. And God can restore intimacy with him. Just because things went cold doesn't mean God doesn't want to bring the relationship back on fire. I believe that God's got a plan for each and every person in this room. And we talk about it all the time. We talk about grace. And grace is greater than your worst chapter. It doesn't have to be your last chapter.